hello first since I wore my SEIU purple. Surprise in Minnesota is also Prince and Vikings purple. But it is just wonderful to be here with you, Stephen, and with Pat, and with SEIU. And I first want to thank you for the incredible work that you did in 2018. And if you ever wonder if you make a difference or not, I have 4 words for you. Former Governor Scott Walker. So just so you know a little bit about me, my background, a little different than some of the other candidates, and I would not be up here on this stage if it wasn't for unions. My grandpa was an iron ore miner. He worked 1,500 feet underground. My dad still talks about growing up, seeing the coffins in the Catholic Church of all those miners. And if it wasn't for unions, my grandpa probably wouldn't have made it through. But he did because unions made those mines safe. He saved coffee cans. In a coffee can, he saved money to send my dad to college. My dad went to a 2-year college, then got a journalism degree, and was a proud member of the newspaper guild. My mom grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the site of our next convention, and she came over to Minnesota. Why? Because they had strong teachers' unions. And she taught 2nd grade until she was 70 years old. And I stand before you today as the first woman elected to the United States Senate from the state of Minnesota, as the granddaughter of a union member, of a daughter of a newspaper man who was a union member, of a daughter of a teacher who was a union member, and a candidate for president of the United States. That is what unions are about. Unions are about lifting people up. They're about shared prosperity. They're about believing that wherever you came from, or whatever you look like, or whoever you love, you can run for president of the United States. Now, I was thinking of a woman I met a few years ago from Ohio, and she was saying how when her husband had a job, she had a job, she saw a bumper sticker one time that said, "Restore the middle class." She's like, okay, whatever. And then when her husband lost his job, and then when she had to work 2 jobs, she said she started to see the words on that bumper sticker as a prayer. Well, you know what we have to do, my friends at SEIU? We need to make it a reality, right? This is not about rhetoric anymore or bumper stickers. This is about reality. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, I stand with you strongly in the fight for 15. We must get a $15 minimum wage. We must have universal health care. And by the way, this is not only about health care, this is also about long-term care, so that people have access to long-term care. We have to make sure that people are treated fairly, that we have safety rules in place. We need a strong NLRB with strong people, and fight back against state laws that make it hard for unions to organize. And if you want to make this economy strong and stronger than it's been, we need comprehensive immigration reform so that everyone can be part of this economy. So that is my story, and that's where I come from. And I can't wait to get to your questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Senator. So we are at this point in American economic history where corporate profits as a percentage of GDP, national output, is at its highest level since World War II, and worker compensation, wages plus benefits, is at its lowest point since World War II. Why do you think this has happened, and what would you do about this if elected president?
Well, I think a lot of this has happened because the playing field has been tilted to one side, and that is to the wealthy. You see it in that Republican tax bill. You see where those benefits went. Do you have money in the Bahamas? Okay, well, if you don't, you didn't benefit from that tax bill. Because that is what happens time and time again. So I would first step back and look at the dark money that's coming into our politics if I really wanted to change the world here, and I would overturn Citizens United with a constitutional amendment. I would then look at the policies that are in place, and I mentioned some of them today. If you want to get rid of that inequality, you increase the minimum wage. It hasn't happened since I first got to the Senate, when it went up to a little over $7. That's the federal minimum wage right now, guys. So I would go up to $15 minimum wage. I think that is doable. I would make sure that we get universal health care, build on the Affordable Care Act, do something about long-term care, make sure that these bad ideas that the Trump administration had to reverse some of the improvements we made to the NLRB would be reversed. Things like making it harder to have an election and making it take a longer time. The kinds of things they've done to micro-organizing for the joint employers. They've done a bunch of things that make it harder and harder to organize unions. Because I figure when unions do better, all workers do better. And one other thing that we haven't touched on, and maybe we can, is retirement savings. Because 49 million Americans right now, 49 million Americans, they have Social Security, right? But they don't have any kind of other retirement if they're not at a place that has a 401k. And a lot of people are working, and you know I see some heads nodding, at places that don't have 401k. So I have an idea, a bill that we just introduced, Chris Coons from Delaware and myself, that has the support of SEIU, and it's called Up Savings Account. And what it would do is it would say, okay, employers, if you're not going to have a 401k, at least start putting 50 cents an hour into a retirement account for your workers. And if you work overtime, do you know how much money that would mean? $600,000 when you retire. And what would it mean if you've got an emergency expense when 4 out of 10 Americans don't even have the money to spend $400 for an emergency room? You know what that would mean? That would mean that every year you could take out, with no penalties, up to $2,500 for those kinds of emergency expenses. We call it Up Savings Account because it lifts people up. You could bring it with you if you change jobs. You can have it if you have a part-time job. And what this gets at is the reality that if we want to secure America, we have to make sure Americans are secure when they retire.
You mentioned before that Scott Walker lost in this race for his third term. But in 2011, he and the Republican legislature in Wisconsin enacted legislation that really started to cripple public sector unions, and then the Republicans enacted an anti-union fee bill called a Right to Work bill. We saw that in Michigan, we saw it in Indiana. What effect do you think this has had in politics in the Midwest? And what do you think? It certainly seems to help Donald Trump win, I believe, in some of these states. And what do you think should be done to reverse this?
Well, as your president, I view my job as, of course, number one, being the president, but number two, it's bringing people with you. When you run for office, you don't just run for yourself. You run for the people that are at your side, but you also run for the state politics as well. You run for people who are running for governor, people who are running for legislature. That's how I've always seen it in Minnesota, because I come from what we'll call a purple state, right? Sometimes it goes Republican, sometimes it goes Democratic. So if you really want to make those fundamental changes on the state basis, then you've also got to change some of those governors out, which, by the way, thank you, Illinois, you did that. The lead plaintiff, one of the lead plaintiffs in that Janice case was, in fact, the former governor of Illinois. So my first answer to you is just straight out, you win. You take on these elections, you do what SEIU has done, which is to knock on, over 3 million doors in the last election. And because of that work, you turn those governor's races, which can turn the politics, which can turn those policies. And then you also made the House of Representatives the people's house again. And then that allows us to take those policies on in a big way. And then there's things we can do on the federal level as well. There's changes we can make to make it easier to organize, to make it easier to reinstate employees after they're fired under the NLRB rules when they're wrongfully fired. We can make it easier to have some kind of penalties and higher stakes if employers try to delegitimize union organizing or try to do things propaganda that's not true and try to do everything to undermine the ability of employees to organize. There are changes that we can make to those rules on the federal basis. And then one other thing I would say to get at kind of both your questions about what you do about this consolidated power that we are taking on right now. We have to do more with our antitrust laws. Now, I didn't expect a big applause for that line of antitrust. I'm kidding. The word antitrust sounds a little boring, right? But what it's about that things are getting too big, right? That companies are getting too large. That we have a situation where there's not an even playing field when in many of our industries, like when you go online and you want to try to get a good deal for travel, and you go and you look at all those sites, right, Expedia, all those things, there's really only two companies that dominate the market. They just pretend they're different companies with different names. So that makes for less competition. So a lot of this is changing the way those rules work to make sure our Justice Department can enforce those laws. And by the way, when we talk about minimum wage, we also should be enforcing the minimum wage laws, right? We should make sure there's not wage theft, but making sure they can enforce the antitrust laws. They have the resources to take on what is now increasingly a new guild today, and that we also have the ability to change some of those rules. And I have some legislation, a plan to do that, which basically says, look, if you're one of these big mega mergers, you've got to be able to show that it doesn't hurt competition. Because when you look at the history of the labor market and what was going on in Chicago with the Pullman strike, the Haymarket strike, and you know this, you wrote a book on this, right, Stephen, the history of the labor market. A lot of this followed along with antitrust changes. So this is something else that we should be looking at.
Thank you. You recently put forward an ambitious proposal to improve the nation's ailing infrastructure, and you said you proposed that you said we need $1 trillion in infrastructure spending, not just for our terrible roads and bridges, but also for schools. In addition to your infrastructure plan, which you say will create good middle-class union jobs, in addition to raising the minimum wage, what other ideas would you put forward to enable workers to move into higher paying, higher skilled, more secure jobs?
Very good. Well, the infrastructure idea is something for anyone that lives. Is anyone here from Michigan? When you think of the people of Flint, Michigan, thank you over there, quiet Midwesterners. When you think about, thank you, person waving. When you think about Flint and what happened there, they are still drinking bottled water out of Flint, Michigan. It is an outrageous situation. You've got schools that are crumbling. So in Baltimore, they didn't even have heat in some of their schools this last winter. You've got needs for transit and rail. And so the infrastructure, as long as you know, that sounds like some Washington project, it is really about getting people to work and making it easy. People of color are disproportionately hurt by the fact if we don't have transit and we don't have easy ways to get people to work. It's a big problem to have any kind of upward mobility or get the kind of lift we want, or people spend 2 hours trying to get to their jobs because they don't have a car. We should be making it easier for people to get to work. So this package I put together is paid for by repealing some of the bad parts of that Republican tax bill, right? That brings in enough money, and I have actually shown how I'm going to pay for it. Because on election night, Donald Trump said that he wanted to do this big infrastructure package. Have you seen any of it in your lives? No, because he hasn't gotten it done. What else can we do to help people? Well, some of the things we talked about here, making child care easier, right? Increasing the minimum wage, making workforce training easier so that people, when they're at a workplace and they want to get some more skills, that they can go to school or they can learn things by having some of the classes come into their workplace. There's all kinds of things that they can do. But the key here is to see our workers as part of this economy, the major part of the economy, the people that drive the economy. Because if people can't get paid enough, to buy a pair of jeans, what's going to happen to those clothing stores, right? The idea here is that to make this American economy work, we all have to be a part of it, and that means paying people right, making sure they have the health care so they can do their jobs, making sure they can get to work, and making sure that we have an economy that includes everyone, that isn't just for the richest people.
Thank you. Picking up on the need for improved health care, tens of millions of workers, especially low-wage workers and disproportionate workers of color, do not have health coverage. What do you recommend the nation do to ensure universal health coverage and to rein in out-of-control soaring drug prices?
Well, first of all, I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is that we have to get to universal health care. Everyone should be able to have health care. Health care should not be a privilege, it should be a right in this country. We have the Affordable Care Act, and what we saw in the last few years is the Republicans in Congress and the Trump administration do everything to try to dismantle it, right? They tried to sabotage it, to not make it available to people, and they have very clearly, in just the last month, said they want to repeal the whole thing. Well, do you know what that means? Those are the protections for pre-existing conditions. And people didn't really know what that word was until we started talking about it in the last few years. I remember seeing a mom pushing her toddler in a stroller in a little parade, and she pointed to her kid, and she said, "This is my son. He's got Down syndrome, and I will do anything to fight for my boy." And then she said, "This is what a pre-existing condition looks like." Because there was a connection between the Affordable Care Act and what her son's future is. And that's what we're going to have to keep pushing when it comes to health care. I remember when we were debating the Affordable Care Act, there was a finance committee meeting, and Debbie Stabenow, who's a senator from Michigan, was, I think, the only woman at the table. And one of the guys, the Republican guy, said, "Well, I don't know why you need maternity care in this package of benefits." And she looked across from him, "What do you mean?" she said. And he said, "Well, I would never use it." And then without missing a beat, she said, "I bet your mother did." So the point here is that we have made strides, right? And we have to make sure we protect them. But then we also have to know that the Affordable Care Act was just the beginning. It's not an end. So how can we improve it? Well, the first thing that I would do is to bring out something we wanted to have back when they put out. That is the public option, right? It can be Medicare, it can be Medicaid, but we must have a public option because that will not only give people a choice, it will help to bring those costs down. The second thing that we can do is take on the pharmaceutical companies, which I've been doing since I first got to Washington. Pharmaceuticals, they've got 2 lobbyists for every single member of Congress. It's true. But you know what? They may own some of those people, they don't own me. One of the first bills that I introduced was to make sure that we can negotiate better prices with Medicare pharmaceuticals. And then we got to stop the big pharma companies from keeping generic off the market because those are lower prices. That's what happened with insulin. I brought a woman to...
Sorry, we need to take questions from...
Oh, the audience. Okay, well, hopefully you asked about pharma because I got a good story.
Sorry. Miriam Pineda?
Hi there. Miriam?
Miriam is a janitor from Maryland and a member of Local 32BJ, the SEIU, who came to the United States 20 years ago through the Temporary Protected Status Program.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Miriam Pineda, janitor de Maryland, donde yo vivo.
Hello, my name is Miriam Pineda. I am a janitor in Maryland, where I live.
Hace 22 años vivo en este país. Vengo de Honduras, tratando de huir de la violencia de mi país.
I came 22 years ago from Honduras, escaping the violence in the country.
Estábamos tratando de organizar los trabajadores, pero se me amenazó a muerte. Nosotros pudimos escapar, otros los mataron.
I was organizing my co-workers at work, and the bosses, they threatened us with our life, and I was able to escape, but others couldn't, and they were killed.
Oh, sorry.
En el 1999 nos dieron el TPS.
In 1989, we got the TPS status.
Este es mi país. 22BJ es mi familia. Aún así, sigo trabajando, apoyando a los trabajadores.
So this is my country, 32BJ is my family, and I am still fighting for workers' rights.
Nosotros los de TPS contribuimos a las cosas de este país y no podemos echar para atrás.
Yeah, so we contribute to this country with our work, with our taxes, and we want to stop.
No sé por qué el señor Trump no nos quiere ayudar, nos quiere echar de aquí. ¿Por qué? Si nosotros contribuimos pagando nuestros impuestos.
And President Trump want us to leave, but we are contributing with our work.
Ahora quiero hacerle una pregunta a usted, senador. Mi pregunta es, ¿qué va a hacer para ayudar de forma permanente a gente como yo que venimos escapando de la violencia y estamos preocupados por poder quedarnos?
So my question for you, Senator, is what are you going to do to permanently help people like me who escaped violence and we are concerned about staying in the country? Thank you.
Gracias, and thank you for sharing that story with me and with all of us here. You should be able to stay in this country. That is the number one. That is a value statement from our country. You came over here legally to escape violence, as did so many others that are on that stand of the TPS, whether they're from Salvador, whether they're from Honduras, whether they are from Haiti, whether they're from, in my home state of Minnesota, Liberia. And time again, the status, the temporary status, has been extended, right, by various administrations, including George Bush, including Republican administrations. Yet this administration, the Trump administration, when we are at a time when we actually need workers like yourself, we need workers in our airports, we need workers in our nursing homes and in our hospitals, they have decided in a very mean-spirited way, in a way that is not good for our economy, to turn their back on these workers. And I think it's wrong, and as president, I would create a permanent status, right? I would pass comprehensive immigration reform. And when you look at what we did, when we actually passed a bill in the Senate, and I was part of that as a member of the Judiciary Committee, when we passed that bill with Republican support, because we had a leader in the White House in President Obama who wanted to get it done, we included the TPS workers and allowed them to stay. I just recently dealt with this with our Liberian population, pushed the administration, called them. I said, are you going to put a bunch of people who've been here for 30 years, who some of them are on walkers and wheelchairs, who've worked in our country our whole life, you're going to just put them on a plane and send them away? In that case, they didn't. But right now, as you know, it is only the courts that are holding up this challenge that this administration is making to this. I think it's a challenge to our economy. You also have dreamers, people who are brought over here through no fault of their own, who deserve to also be in this country. And that is why I strongly support a path to citizenship. I finally was trying to think, how can I explain this at home? And I found a 99-year-old Hispanic war veteran in Minnesota who had been brought over to Sleepy Eye, Minnesota when he was 5 years old. He didn't know it, and he signed up to serve in World War II. Back then, you know what they did? The Army brought him to Canada for one night, and then they came back and they were citizens. That's what they did. And then he went over, he served under General MacArthur, he came back to our country, got married, had a kid who served in the Vietnam War, and I brought him to stand in front of the World War II memorial, that proud veteran, 99 years old, with two dreamers from the suburbs who wanted to be in the Air Force but couldn't. This is about patriotism, and I believe immigrants don't diminish America, they are America.
The next question is from Katrina Hayward. Katrina was a night shift patient care technician at a hospital in Chicago.
Thank you. You're from the Midwest.
Yes. So last month I quit my job working as a nursing assistant at a hospital in Chicago. I love my job. The thing was my job didn't love me. Imagine being the only CNA having to assist every nurse with up to 16 highly critical, highly infectious patients for 12 hours for only $13 an hour. Non-union hospitals constantly understaffed and underpaid us. There was never enough money to pay rent on time and buy enough groceries to feed my daughter. When it came down to her, I knew I had to start making better decisions. I decided to join the fight with other hospital workers all around Chicago for unions citywide. The system is rigged for big corporations and greedy bosses to have all the power. We will continue to call out industries like the Illinois Hospital Association to negotiate with us as a union until they give the power back to the working people. We try to hold them accountable for these unfair conditions that keep working families from moving forward. My question to you is, do you think we should have the right to reach these kind of citywide and industry-wide agreements? And along with that, how would you make it possible for millions of workers to join unions and other workers' organizations?
Thank you. Yes, I do. And I think you heard my story. I wouldn't be up here right now. I had the privilege to talk with all of you if it wasn't for unions, right? If they didn't allow unions to organize. My mom wouldn't have had the kind of job she had. She grew up poor to be a teacher. Or my grandpa wouldn't have been safe in his job. Or my dad wouldn't have been able to do what he did and afford to go to a two-year community college and then state college in Minnesota. This is all about unions. It's all about people having the right to organize and having power. And I feel it deeply in my heart. So when I hear your story, my first thing is, why are you making $13 an hour? We got to go with SEIU with the fight for 15. Okay, that's my first reaction. My second reaction is that we've got an administration right now in power that's doing everything they can to push back to make it harder to organize. And that's not what we should be doing. We should be making it easier for workers to organize and be part of that economy. Because right now, and I think some of these companies are learning this, we don't have enough workers and the wages aren't good enough, and you don't have enough people working in areas where we need them to work, like what you were doing. And so that will push, but what will really push is making sure that we have the strong right to organize and that everyone has the right to join the union. And my last pitch to all of you, since this is a political forum, is the way you really can make change is you make political change, right? You think of the arc of justice that we've been on. You are the welders that have shortened that arc. You think of the day that Donald Trump got sworn into office, that dark day. The next day, millions of people marched peacefully all across this country. That happened. That is part of that arc that you are on. And when you were in that job and it was so tough and you had to deal with them, think that you're not alone, right? 10 days after that, when they put out that anti-refugee ban, what happens? People spontaneously show up at the airports, right? That happened. You go through the summer when they try to repeal the Affordable Care Act, we all stood up together. You look to the fall in that great victory against racism and for dignity and decency when Doug Jones won in the state of Alabama, right? This is the march that we are on together. So yes, we fight each fight, but we have to also see it as a political fight. This is about winning and losing. This is about justice, and justice can be won. It's hard to win it in the courts right now, so the best place we win it is at the ballot box.
Thank you, Senator. So we have 90 seconds left, 10 minutes left. I invite you to tell the story you were going to tell about pharmacies, or
Okay,
when I cut you off.
All right, good. Well, I want to end with that because I love taking this on. Because I think we have to do it. It is nearly 20% of our healthcare costs right now. So I was talking about how you do it. You do it with negotiating Medicare. That's probably the best thing, because that's just not about seniors, that's about everyone. It'll bring the prices down. You do it by getting more competition on the market with these generics who they're trying to push off, and you do it by actually bringing in drugs from less expensive countries like Canada that are safe, because I can see Canada from my porch in Minnesota, so I kind of like that. But I'll end with the story of this woman named Nicole Smith Holt, who I brought to the State of the Union. And I brought her there because she had something tragic happen to her, and just like you, she's taking her story and putting it into action. She has a son who was 26 years old. He aged off her health insurance. He was a restaurant manager in a store, and he didn't have enough money to afford his $1,200 a month insulin. Insulin that used to be $18 a vial, and he couldn't afford it. So you know what he did in the greatest country that's ours? He started rationing it, and he got the numbers off, and he died. So what Nicole has done is she said she cried for months, but then she said, I'm not going to let this happen to anyone else. And so she sat there in that House chamber looking down at President Trump and looking at him because he promised he was going to do something about pharmaceutical prices. And when he put out his plan, you know what happened? Their stocks went up. Well, let me tell you, that is not going to happen when I come there, because what I'm going to do is bring your prices down and help the Nicole Smith Holt so we never have a 26-year-old again or any other kid that's forced to ration insulin in the United States of America. Let's get to work. I want to win this. I'd love to have your support. Thank you, everybody.